Imagine stepping onto the ice and knowing that the man waiting on the other side could end your night with a single hit. That was the feeling across the NHL in the 1980s and 1990s when Scott Stevens laced up his skates. He wasn't just another defenseman. He was a force of nature, a player whose very presence changed how opponents played the game. Some called him the most feared hitter of his era. Others saw him as the backbone of championship teams. Either way, Stevens left a mark on hockey that will never fade. But to understand how a kid from Kitchener, Ontario became one of the most intimidating figures in NHL history, you have to start at the beginning. Growing up in Canada, hockey wasn't just a sport, it was a way of life. Stevens had a natural drive, a competitive fire that stood out even when he was young. He wasn't the flashiest player, but he had something coaches loved: toughness, leadership, and an instinct for the game. In 1982, that journey officially began when the Washington Capitals drafted Stevens 5th overall. For a franchise struggling to find its footing, this was a major moment. The Capitals were desperate for an identity, and Stevens gave them one. From the moment he joined the team, he played with a physical edge that demanded attention. He wasn't afraid to throw his body around, and opponents quickly learned that cutting across the middle of the ice when Stevens was out there was a dangerous gamble. But Stevens wasn't only about brute force. His game had balance. He could move the puck, contribute offensively, and anchor the blue line with a presence beyond his years. By his second season, he was already a cornerstone for the Capitals. His leadership shined, and his punishing hits became highlights that defined Washington's style of play. Fans loved him because he gave them something they had never had before: a star who embodied grit, strength, and the relentless will to win. Stevens spent 8 seasons with the Capitals, growing into one of the league's premier defensemen. He helped turn Washington from a struggling expansion team into a contender, bringing a hard-nosed style of hockey that set the tone for years to come. Still, even with all the success he brought to the Capitals, Stevens' journey was just beginning. The twists and turns ahead, contract disputes, shocking trades, and the legacy built in New Jersey would take his story to a whole new level. Because as good as Stevens was in Washington, nobody could have predicted the impact he would have once he left. In 1990, after years of being the Capitals' cornerstone, Stevens was dealt to the St. Louis Blues. For Blues fans, it was a dream come true. They had just acquired one of the league's toughest, most respected defensemen, and expectations skyrocketed overnight. Stevens wasted no time showing St. Louis what he could do. In his one season there, he played with the same edge, the same commanding presence that had made him a star in Washington. He was more than just a big hitter, he was a leader on and off the ice. But as quickly as he arrived, Stevens was gone. The reason? A contract tug-of-war that would become one of the most dramatic sagas in NHL history. The St. Louis Blues signed Brendan Shanahan, a rising young star from the New Jersey Devils. But there was a catch. National rules at the time required compensation when a restricted free agent was signed. The Devils demanded Stevens. The Blues fought it. Courts got involved. But in the end, the ruling was clear. Scott Stevens was leaving St. Louis after just one season to join the New Jersey Devils. For New Jersey, though, it was the start of something historic. At that point, the Devils were still seen as an underdog franchise, a team without a true identity. But with Stevens arriving, that began to change. He didn't just wear the Devils jersey, he embodied it. Stevens was tough, disciplined, and relentless, the exact qualities that would come to define New Jersey hockey in the 1990s and early 2000s. The Devils had leaders before, but Stevens gave them a captain unlike any other. Someone who didn't just talk about accountability, but lived it every night on the ice. This wasn't just about hard hits or strong defense. Stevens gave the Devils something they had been missing: belief. Under his leadership, the team started to see themselves not as underdogs, but as contenders. And while fans in Washington and St. Louis still missed him, Stevens was about to build his true legacy in New Jersey. It was there in the swamps of the Meadowlands that Scott Stevens would transform from star defenseman into an NHL legend. By the mid-1990s, the New Jersey Devils had become a different kind of team, and at the center of it all was Scott Stevens. His leadership didn't just show up in stats or highlight reels. It showed up in how the Devils carried themselves every single night. Opponents hated playing against them because they knew what was waiting: a suffocating defense, a brick wall goalie, and Stevens patrolling the blue line like a shark smelling blood. The Devils' style became famous or infamous, depending on who you asked. They played a disciplined, structured game built around shutting down opponents and capitalizing on mistakes. Some critics called it boring. Fans in New Jersey called it brilliant. And Stevens was the perfect captain for that style. He was a master at punishing anyone who dared to skate through the middle of the ice with their head down. His hits weren't just big, they were game-changing. A single collision could tilt the momentum completely in New Jersey's favor. The payoff came in 1995. The Devils marched through the playoffs with confidence, shutting down team after team until they reached the Stanley Cup final against the heavily favored Detroit Red Wings. It was the first Stanley Cup in franchise history, and Stevens was right in the heart of it, setting the tone with his fearless play. That victory cemented Stevens as more than just a great defenseman. He was now the captain of a Stanley Cup champion, a leader who had guided his team to the ultimate prize. For the Devils, it was a transformation from underdogs to champions in just a few years. And for Stevens, it was validation. All the hits, all the sacrifices, all the years of grinding, suddenly it was worth it. But this was only the beginning. Stevens wasn't satisfied with just one championship. He wanted more, and so did the Devils. Over the next several seasons, New Jersey became one of the league's most consistent contenders. And with each playoff run, Stevens' reputation grew. Opponents began circling the calendar whenever they had to face him. Players admitted later that they thought twice before cutting across the ice when Stevens was out there. That's the kind of respect and fear he commanded. Still, the greatest chapters of his career were yet to be written. Because as legendary as his first cup win was, the moments that would make Scott Stevens a household name were still to come. Moments that weren't just about winning games, but about changing the course of playoff series with a single thunderous hit. By the late 1990s, Scott Stevens was more than a captain. He was the heartbeat of the Devils. His leadership went beyond words. Teammates often said Stevens didn't need to give long speeches in the locker room. All it took was one shift, one hit, and everyone knew the standard they had to meet. He was a captain who led with action, and it made him one of the most respected figures in hockey. The Devils returned to the Stanley Cup final in 2000, facing the high-powered Dallas Stars. This series was a clash of styles. New Jersey's suffocating defense against Dallas's skill and grit. But once again, Stevens set the tone. His physical presence frustrated the Stars, and his leadership kept the Devils steady in high-pressure moments. In Game 6, Jason Arnott scored the overtime winner, and just like that, the Devils captured their second Stanley Cup. For Stevens, it was another career-defining moment. But it wasn't just about the cups. What truly etched Stevens into hockey lore were the hits, those unforgettable, bone-rattling collisions that fans still talk about decades later. One of the most famous came during the 2000 playoffs in the Eastern Conference Final against the Philadelphia Flyers. The Flyers had a young superstar in Eric Lindros, a towering center who played the game with both power and finesse. Lindros was supposed to be unstoppable, but in Game 7, Stevens met him at center ice with a thunderous hit that instantly became one of the most iconic moments in NHL history. It wasn't just the sound of the collision, or the way Lindros dropped to the ice. It was what that moment represented. In one instant, Stevens had changed the game. He had shifted the energy completely to New Jersey, and the Devils went on to advance to the Stanley Cup final. That hit became a symbol of everything Stevens stood for: toughness, timing, and an almost scary ability to rise to the biggest moments. Fans who loved him saw it as the perfect example of clean, hard hockey. Critics said it was too brutal, but one thing was undeniable: nobody could ignore it. That was the essence of Scott Stevens. Whether you thought his hits were fair or over the line, he made you feel something, and that's what made him unforgettable. As the 2001 playoffs approached, another cup run, more battles, more highlights. The 2001 season showed the hockey world just how hard it is to repeat as champions. The Devils made it all the way back to the Stanley Cup final, this time against the Colorado Avalanche. It was a heavyweight battle, two teams loaded with talent, leadership, and pride. The Devils pushed the series to 7 games, but in the end, Colorado came out on top. For Stevens, it was a bitter pill to swallow. He had played brilliantly, throwing his body into every battle, but the dream of back-to-back cups slipped away. If anyone thought that loss would slow the Devils down, they were wrong. Stevens and his teammates came back hungrier than ever. In 2003, they made another deep playoff run, and once again, Stevens' leadership was on full display. He wasn't just delivering punishing hits, he was the calm in the storm. That year's playoffs gave us another unforgettable Stevens moment. In the second round against the mighty Ducks of Anaheim, young forward Paul Kariya seemed unstoppable. But then came one of the most famous collisions of the decade. Stevens stepped up and delivered a crushing hit that sent Kariya crashing to the ice. For a few terrifying seconds, the arena went silent. Kariya eventually returned to the game, an iconic moment in its own right. But the image of Stevens delivering yet another thunderous blow only added to his legend. The Devils went on to defeat Anaheim in a 7-game series, capturing their 3rd Stanley Cup in less than a decade. For Stevens, it was the crowning achievement of his career: 3 championships, countless playoff runs, and a reputation as one of the most feared and respected players of his era. By then, Stevens wasn't just a captain. He was a symbol of everything the Devils stood for: discipline, toughness, and team-first hockey. When you thought of New Jersey, you thought of that trap system, the rock-solid defense, and most of all, You thought of Scott Stevens standing tall on the blue line, ready to shut down anyone who dared to challenge him. Even as the years went on and his body began to wear down, Stevens remained a presence that opponents had to account for. He wasn't chasing numbers, personal awards, or headlines. He was chasing wins. That's what made him different. That's what made him great. But as with every career, time eventually catches up, even to legends. And for Scott Stevens, the closing chapter of his playing days would mark the end of an era not just for him, but for the Devils as well. By the mid-2000s, the years of punishing hits, long playoff runs, and all-out physical play began to take their toll on Scott Stevens. The body that had delivered so many thunderous checks and carried the Devils to 3 championships was wearing down. In 2004, after suffering from post-concussion symptoms, Stevens was forced to step away from the game. It wasn't the ending he, or Devils fans, had imagined, but it was a reminder of just how much he had sacrificed for the sport he loved. When Stevens officially announced his retirement in 2005, it felt like the end of an era. The Devils lost more than just a captain. They lost the heartbeat of their franchise. For over a decade, Stevens had been the standard, the leader who defined what it meant to play New Jersey Devils hockey. His number 4 was retired soon after, raised to the rafters as a permanent reminder of everything he had given to the team and the game. Looking back, Stevens' legacy is complicated, but in the best way. To Devils fans, he was the ultimate warrior, the captain who brought 3 Stanley Cups to New Jersey and led by example every single night. What made him truly special wasn't just the hits, though they're still replayed endlessly in highlight reels. It wasn't even just the championships, though those banners will hang forever. It was the way Stevens combined all of it, skill, leadership, toughness, and heart, into one complete package. He showed that a captain didn't need to be the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes, leadership is about being the most reliable presence, the one everyone looks to when the pressure is highest. Today, when fans debate the greatest defenseman of all time, Stevens' name always comes up. Some remember him for the hits, others for the cups, but everyone remembers him. And that's the ultimate measure of a legend, not just what you achieved, but the lasting impact you leave behind. Scott Stevens may have stepped away from the ice, but his shadow still lingers over the game. Every time a player thinks twice before skating through the middle, every time a captain inspires his team without saying a word, a little piece of Stevens' legacy lives on. He wasn't just a defenseman. He wasn't just a captain. He was the kind of player you only see once in a generation. A player who changed the game and whose story will be told for as long as hockey is played.